On August 9, 1944, in a quiet headquarters away from the hedgerows, General Hinrich Eberbach leaned over a wooden table and traced the spidery lines of Normandy with a finger. The map was worn at the folds. The inked roads led to towns that smelled of wet earth and smoke. Around him, the distant thunder of artillery kept time like a metronome. He counted tanks, roughly 900 machines, Tigers, Panthers, assault guns, that he believed, if placed into the bocage and hedgerows with skill and ferocity, could blunt the American advance. Numbers comforted him. They suggested a solidity that tactics could be built upon. Armor in the right place, crewed by disciplined men, could stop a tide. He was not wrong to trust armor as a decisive instrument. German tanks in skilled hands could inflict disproportionate damage, but the map on his table could not show the invisible arteries that fed an army, the railheads, the fuel caches, the recovery trucks that pulled crippled tanks back from the mud. What his map could not convey was that a different war was being waged behind the lines, a war not of hedgerows and ambushes but of docks, factories, warehouses, and long columns of trucks. He had 900 tanks. Across the Atlantic and behind the American front, an industrial machine was turning out replacements, moving fuel, and calculating tonnages in a language of supply that did not listen to bravery. If you want more deep, evidence-driven military history that peels back the myth and looks at why battles were actually won and lost, subscribe now. This channel does exactly that. Eberbach's assumption was familiar among commanders who had fought with craftsmanship and training. Assume parity of fuel. Presume the rail net will hold. Trust that a disabled tank can be recovered and returned to battle. Tactically, the Germans could still produce local, sometimes spectacular victories. A Panther commander could stage an ambush at Lierre, cutting a wedge into an American column and sending steel and smoke into the fields. These tactical sharp points mattered, yet each moment of tactical success required a supply tail to sustain it, fuel to move to and from the ambush, spare parts to fix what the enemy's shells did not finish, recovery vehicles to drag the knocked-out metal back from the sides of lanes and back into workshops. Without that tail, even the sharpest blade will dull. On the German side, those arteries had been under systematic pressure for months. Allied air interdiction, bombing of rail lines, and targeted strikes on bridges fractured the rail network that had been the backbone of German resupply. Where once trains could move fuel and ammunition hundreds of miles behind the front, now shipments stalled or were rerouted through longer, more vulnerable roads. The destruction of rail was not a single dramatic event on a map. It was a daily erosion. Fuel that should have reached depots never arrived. Spare parts meant for gearbox repairs sat in yards stranded by a single missing rail car. The scarcity rippled down to the crews. Recovery vehicles, often overlooked in narratives that celebrate tanks and their crews, became almost as critical as the tanks themselves. A Panther that could have been repaired with a replaced road wheel or a working engine became a hulking tomb when the tow truck never arrived. Cannibalization became routine. Workshops stripped operational tanks for parts to keep a handful of vehicles running. Soldiers learned to become mechanics in the night, performing desperate repairs beneath dim blue filters to avoid drawing air attack. Men worked with diesel under their fingernails with the smell of overheated oil hanging in the air, improvising fixes that only delayed the inevitable. Sleep disappeared. Stimulants such as Pervitin were used to keep units moving. Those are human details, the everyday resourcefulness of a military machine with its lungs clogged. Fuel scarcity alone could stop an entire division. Tanks, even the heavy Tigers and Panthers, were not independent agents. They were walking fuel tanks. Without gasoline and diesel, they were statues. Engines cold, turrets fixed, guns pointing at fields they could no longer reach. Crews sometimes left vehicles intact and ready to be reclaimed later, but later rarely came. In the Falaise pocket, many German machines were abandoned with their engines warm and their ammunition still stowed. Silent witnesses to a collapse of supply rather than outright destruction in combat. The transcriptionary record that survives that month records 312 vehicles abandoned intact within the pocket. 312, not all burned, not all shattered by fire. Many simply ran out of the things that make a vehicle a weapon: fuel, parts, a recovery convoy. Meanwhile, the Allied side was writing its own story of capacity. The Americans had not only more tanks in production, they had built an apparatus to move men and materiel at a sustained throughput. The Mulberry harbors, artificial piers erected to funnel supplies ashore, helped bridge the immediate gap after D-Day. Cherbourg, once seized, increased throughput inland. Behind that, ordnance parks collected, repaired, and redistributed vehicles at scale. An ordnance park was not a magical place. It was a logistics node where rows of damaged and new machines could be inventoried, repaired, refitted, or issued. Picture an American soldier, after a stand that cost him his M4, signing papers and walking out that evening to a fresh Sherman assigned from the park. In theater, this rapid replacement was a critical force multiplier. The phrase used by the men there, recorded in accounts from the period, captured the raw efficiency. A crew could lose a tank in the morning and be issued a fresh Sherman by evening. That turnover erased much of the cumulative impact of localized German tactical success. The scale of delivery was staggering and, to most frontline soldiers, invisible. The Red Ball Express, a legendary truck convoy system that moved supplies from ports to forward depots, burned fuel to deliver fuel. Thousands of trucks, many driven by African American soldiers whose labor and courage sustained the advance, ran routes day and night, delivering gasoline, ammunition, food, and spare parts. Convoys became a second front. If the enemy could interdict roads or damage bridges, they'd slow the flow. But the Americans engineered workarounds at speed. Liberty ships kept arriving from across the Atlantic. Detroit's assembly lines continued to churn out engines and components. Behind the scenes, ordnance parks swallowed incoming wrecks, sorted them, and returned many to service at a tempo the Germans could not match. A figure recorded in the logistical accounting emphasizes the scale. Allied throughput ran in the tens of thousands of tons per day, around 15,000 tons a day moving to the front in the period after breakout. 15,000 tons per day. Rail, road, docks, and trucks combined into a river of supply that, in aggregate, became the front's silent amalgam of power. It is a number that, when juxtaposed with the German predicament, explains much. For the Germans, even if they could win engagements tactically, the ability of the Allies to absorb losses and replace equipment at such a pace meant those battles rarely had cumulative strategic teeth. Production comparisons make the argument more concrete. In August, the German inventory and production figures were dwarfed by American outputs. One contemporary accounting notes roughly 280 German tanks versus 2,600 American tanks in that month, a near 10-to-1 disparity in what the Americans could produce in field. The title figure that frames this story, 900 versus 4,800, requires careful reading. The 900 refers to the operational count Eberbach believed he could deploy, the tanks under his immediate purview. The figure of roughly 4,800 Shermans speaks to the broader American production and replacement capacity available in the theater over weeks and months, not a single, concentrated force arrayed on a single morning against his Panzers. That is the essential, clarifying distinction. The Americans could, across time, keep pressing replacements into the field at a rate the Germans could not match or sustain. Numbers matter, but so do the human stories beneath them. Consider the captured German officer confronted with an Allied inventory. He asked, with the weary frankness of a man assessing a new landscape, "How many tanks do you have?" The reply he received has been preserved in the record, "As many as we need." The sentence is not a boastful declaration of omnipotence. It's an arithmetic observation. It meant that the system, the docks, the trucks, the ordnance parks, the factories, could generate and move tanks faster than attrition could remove them from the order of battle. For the man who had watched his supply lines die under the hammer of interdiction, the answer was a kind of blunt arithmetic that undercut strategy and morale alike. Small vignettes make the arithmetic human. In one scene, a panther wins a local duel at Liézère. The crew celebrates. For a time, their tactical skill is vindicated. They bag a score, their camouflage holds, and they vanish back into the folds of hedgerows. But 2 hours later, Columns of American replacements arrive and the battlefield reinflates. Local victories evaporate when crews cannot be reinforced and disabled tanks cannot be recovered. In another scene in the Falaise pockets churn, soldiers pushed through with stale bread in their pockets and a grease-stained rag for maintenance. They abandoned vehicles that to a passerby looked intact. Hatches closed, guns unspent, engines cooled. Those machines became mute evidence that material paralysis, not the direct action of enemy guns, had done the final work. The accounting inside the Falaise pocket is stark because it removes mystery. Of the vehicles recorded there, a significant number were left intact. 312 are noted as abandoned in usable condition. Others were disabled by direct enemy fire or by air attack. Still more were destroyed by sappers during the desperate hours of retreat to deny them to the Allies. But the 312 intact hulks point to a particular pathology, a force that could no longer move its machines, feed them, or retrieve them. The enemy did not need to burn every tank when logistics had already rendered them unserviceable. Psychology followed the material collapse. Crews who had fought with confidence now found themselves watching fuel lines evaporate and recovery trucks never arrive. Discipline frayed when the simple arithmetic of supply said there were no more parts to be had. Command decisions grew risk-averse or, conversely, reckless, both symptoms of not knowing whether an action would be sustainable. Eberbach's staff, watching the map and the shrinking pools of operational tanks, had to reconcile tactical plans with the practical reality that tanks were functioning only as long as fuel and parts held up. Where a commander once calibrated attacks on the assumption that lost armor could be replaced, now the assumption failed, and plans based on numbers became hollow. The industrial processes that sustained the Americans were not abstract either. Behind the abstract figure of 15,000 tons per day were people who loaded and unloaded, who drove the convoys, who rebuilt transmissions in ordnance parks under time pressure, and who coordinated shipping schedules. Liberty ships were converted into numbers on manifest lists, but each manifest was labor. Welders in shipyards, dock workers, clerks shoving bills of lading, drivers resting on a favorite blanket between runs. Factory floors hummed in Detroit and other industrial centers, turning raw materials into armor plate, into engines, into radios. The metaphor of the spreadsheet, dry and arithmetic, understates the human scale. But the spreadsheet mattered. It translated production into predictable replacement, and predictable replacement into battlefield resilience. That resilience reshaped the strategic landscape. Where a German commander could win a local fight and produce a tactical miracle, the Allied system could absorb that miracle and erase its cumulative effects the next day. The practical outcome was not that German crews were less skilled, many were not. It was that skill could not operate in a vacuum. Without fuel, and without the ability to repair or replace, tactical victories could not be sustained. That is the central analytic thread of this episode, where industrial mathematics, the steady calculation of production, repair, and movement, met craftsmanship and brilliance on the battlefield. Arithmetic often trumped heroism. The climax of this collapse is symbolized in the accounting that closes this episode. In August, American tank production and the forward inventory figures gave them several thousand Shermans in theater or available for replacement. German production and reserves could not match that flow. German divisions went from dozens of operational tanks to near zero in the space of weeks, not always because enemy guns had fired them into ruin, but because fuel and spares had not reached them. On August 31st, the personal arc of this collapse crystallized. General Hinrich Eberbach was captured. The map he had touched weeks earlier sat in other hands. The tactical formations he had trusted lay in fields and yards, many machines abandoned or awaiting parts that would not arrive. Yet it would be an error to cast this as a moral judgment in the narrow sense, a condemnation of individual commanders or crews. The story is systemic. It is a lesson about the decisive role of logistics in modern mechanized warfare. A tank is a technical synthesis: armor, suspension, gun, engine, crew. If any one of these subsystems is starved, especially the engine's lifeblood of fuel or the supply chain of replacement parts, the whole system seizes. The Allies' advantage was not a single battlefield strategy. but an industrial scale that translated into operational resilience. Docks that would not stop receiving ships, ordnance parks that could rebuild, convoys that could move daily tonnages measured in 5 digits. What does the numeric framing in the title mean then? He had 900 tanks under his command, a tactical concentration that felt formidable in a map room. The Allied side, through production and replacement, could field or supply thousands of Sherman tanks over the course of weeks and months. Figures commonly cited in contemporary accounting put that number in the thousands and at times approximated at around 4,800 when discussing the theater's replacement potential. The crucial point is that those thousands were not necessarily thrown as a single hammer blow. They were fed into the system persistently, steadily replacing losses and increasing the attritional threshold an attacker had to impose to change the strategic balance. In practice, a German success that left a dozen armored vehicles disabled might be erased almost immediately because the Americans could replenish those dozen by evening or the next day. Over time, the arithmetic favored the side that could sustain losses repeatedly without a corresponding collapse in capability. This is not to say tactics did not matter. They did, decisively, in many moments. The Panther at Les Isères matters. The skill of a crew who halts an attack matters. But when tactics exist in a context where one side can replace losses on an industrial scale while the other cannot, the strategic weight of those local tactical successes is severely constrained. The decisive weapon in this episode was not a single gun or a daring charge. It was a composite of docks, factories, convoys, and warehouses. An invisible apparatus that could produce and move material in volumes the opponents could not match. The human toll of that arithmetic is also part of the story. Men who watched their vehicles abandoned felt a particular kind of despair. Not the immediate terror of combat, but the slow comprehension that what they had was being starved. Discipline and morale are as dependent on supply as they are on leadership. The files from the Falaise pocket, the record of 312 abandoned vehicles, and the monthly production comparisons illustrate a structural truth. Armies require more than skill. They require sustainment. When the last tally is taken, the narrative is both sobering and instructive. Eberbach's map room moment on August 9th is an image of confidence based on visible assets. The later photographs of tanks standing mute in fields, of ordnance parks filled with rows of Shermans, of trucks threading the arteries that fed the front tell a different story. The story of industrial mathematics outpacing tactical craftsmanship. It is a lesson that reshapes how we think about victory and defeat in mechanized war. So what should we take away? First, numbers on a map are only as meaningful as the systems that support them. 900 tanks can be decisive. If those tanks can move, be refueled, repaired, and recovered. Second, industrial capacity and logistical throughput can neutralize repeated tactical successes by removing their cumulative effect. Third, the psychological collapse of forces under supply strain is an immediate and powerful effect that can do as much damage as any artillery barrage. If this breakdown of how logistics beat tactics in Normandy resonates, leave a comment and tell us which logistics-driven turning points in history you'd like us to examine next. If you're interested in a deeper dive on industrial warfare, check the playlist linked below for more episodes examining how factories, docks, and supply chains shaped the battlefields of the 20th century. In the end, the story is not of a single moment of heroism or villainy, it is of systems. General Eberbach counted 900 tanks on a map and planned accordingly. Across the ocean, an industrial machine counted in thousands and, through steady throughput and replacement, rendered many of his calculations irrelevant. The battlefield can be heroic, but the war is won or lost on paper as much as it is on soil. In manifest lists, ordnance park inventories, and daily tonnages that add up to an overwhelming logistical advantage. The machines that lay abandoned in the hedgerows were not only casualties of war, they were the proof that in 1944 in Normandy, arithmetic could be as lethal as any gun.